And while it would certainly be cool to have an eldritch horror rising from the deep, tentacles poised to attack these unsuspecting men and drag them down, we know that these men weren't gobbled up by a sea creature. Now, I've even read theories that a giant seabird came and scooped them up as well, but they'd have to be like the great eagles of Middle-earth to be able to pull that off. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that covers unpopular stories from history. Stories about disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. On December 26th, 1900, an assistant lighthouse keeper named Joseph Moore sailed to Eilean Mòr, the largest of the Flannan Isles, part of Scotland's Outer Hebrides. He was there to replace one of the keepers, men or women who maintain the lighthouse, making sure its light is bright and visible so incoming ships can navigate around the coast, among many other duties. But when Joseph Moore arrived, he felt something was off. There was no light coming from the lighthouse. And he wouldn't have known this, but there hadn't been a light for about 2 weeks by that point. And curiously, nobody was there to greet the new lighthouse keeper. Moore would later note that he felt, quote, an overwhelming sense of foreboding on his long walk up to the top of the cliff. And when Moore finally reached the lighthouse, the 3 men who kept it had disappeared without a trace. In today's episode, we're going to go over the case of the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse. There have been plenty of books and articles written about this mystery, even a 2018 film starring Gerard Butler and Peter Mullen called The Vanishing. The film was just based on the real events. It's not meant to be an accurate retelling of what happened. But the real story reminds me a little bit of the ghost ship Mary Celeste, perhaps even the hikers who died on the Dyatlov Pass, because what really happened, nobody will ever know. All we have to go on are a handful of clues left behind when the 3 men disappeared. So as we normally do on the AF-Out podcast, we'll begin with the historical context. Is there anything we need to know about that lighthouse or that location in particular that might help shed some light on the story? And then we'll go over the types of things lighthouse keepers do. Once we've got all the background and information we need to understand what they do, then we'll try to understand what happened to the lighthouse keepers on Eilean Mòr. So, let's get started. Before we take a look at the scene, let's get a good understanding of the history of the lighthouse of Eilean Mòr, because curiously, the lighthouse was only built about 1 year before the men disappeared. Eilean Mòr and the other Flannan Isles are in northwest Scotland, as I said in the intro, part of the Outer Hebrides. Now, if the Outer Hebrides themselves are considered remote, then the Flannan Isles are even more so, since they're even further northwest than the rest of the islands. This whole region faces the full might of the Atlantic Ocean, and while the seas are reportedly blue and clear, they can be unpredictable. There are strong currents, whipping winds, and rapid weather changes. My husband is a veteran of the Royal Navy, and he spent time training and conducting operations in Scottish waters. Here's what he has to say about the Northwestern Seas. What do you got for us, Neil?
Thanks for having me on, Kelly. So, talking about those waters to the north of Scotland. So, yeah, I did spend some time up there doing various different operations in the Royal Navy. And the specific area I'm going to talk about is sort of to the northwest of Scotland. And the seas up there are unpredictable. So one day it can be the most beautiful, deep blue, and the sea can be very clear, and the sky can be crisp and cold, almost like a winter day that you really enjoy. And then, half an hour or an hour later, it can be the deepest, horrible, miserable grey with mountainous waves. And I remember, it's very, very vivid for me, lots of warships, dozens of warships all sort of doing their manoeuvres, and it being so rough that we all had to hide together in a little sound known as the Minch, which is, a sort of a body of water between the mainland of Scotland and the Outer Hebrides. And so you've got all these modern warships being tossed around like little rowing boats. And I remember being tied by metal cables to the deck and the ship moving around so much, and water coming across, feeling like you're going to get washed away any moment, and a 400-foot long destroyer feeling no bigger than a rowing boat. And while it was awe-inspiring and frightening, it was also incredibly beautiful. And that is something that stayed with me all this time. And you really get a sense that the sea can just undo you at any time. It's quite incredible.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for coming on, Neil. And if anybody out there wants to listen to some of his music, you've definitely heard it. It's the intro and outro song to the Af Out podcast. You can find him and his music everywhere as Nedrick. So go and check out his stuff. Thanks for the insight there. So if the seas are rough and the weather is unpredictable, and the islands themselves pretty remote, it's understandable why they would want to build a lighthouse in the area. The man who designed the lighthouse, David Allen Stevenson, noted that there was a dark spot, if you will, in this area. The nearest lighthouse was 46 miles south-southwest, so any ships passing anywhere close to the Flannan Isles and the nearby island of Lewis had no visibility. Ooh, fun fact. David Allen Stevenson was from a family of lighthouse engineers, and his cousin was the famous Robert Louis Stevenson, the author best known for writing Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's a completely irrelevant fun fact. It has nothing to do with the story whatsoever, but you know I love my random tangents. Now, the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse was built between 1895 and 1899 by the Northern Lighthouse Board, or NLB, the authority responsible for the construction and upkeep of lighthouses in Scotland and also the Isle of Man. I'll be talking about them a lot today, so just remember Northern Lighthouse Board, NLB. It was completed and lit for the first time on December 7th, 1899. And in addition to the lighthouse itself, a shore station was installed on the Isle of Lewis. So if you look at a map of Scotland and just zoom in on the Outer Hebrides, the Isle of Lewis is the large one at the northern end of the chain. It's where Stornoway is. Among a lot of other towns too, of course. It's just that Stornoway always stands out to me because my brother and I used to play this board game at our grandparents' house. It was called the Great Game of Britain, and we'd always strand each other out on Stornoway. That's also really relevant. Sorry, let's move on. Now, the shore station is where the lighthouse keepers' families would live. This particular one was about 20 miles east of the actual lighthouse, across the water, of course. The lighthouse itself is 75 feet tall, or 23 meters, and it sits near the highest point of Eilean Mòr. As such, building it was a huge pain in the you-know-what. Builders had to haul and lift materials up the cliff, which was an imposing 148 feet, or 45 meters tall, and they later built a cable-hauled railway to help shift supplies from the coast to the lighthouse on relief expeditions. Now, at the top of the lighthouse was a rotating lamp that would emit 2 flashes every 30 seconds. The light source itself was a simple kerosene lamp, but the light emitted was magnified by what's known as a Fresnel lens. Now, without getting too deep into the physics of it, because I'm not a physicist, a lens is divided into a series of grooved rings, and they all act like prisms. And as the light passes through them, it refracts at a specific angle and concentrates that light into a powerful beam. The yellowish light from the kerosene lamp isn't going to do much by itself, right? But by using lenses to concentrate that light into a focused beam, it could be seen up to 20 miles away, which is pretty neat. By the way, did you watch The Lighthouse? It was the 2019 Robert Eggers film. It was black and white. It was very art house. It was a horror film. Starred Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. That had some really good close-ups of the Fresnel lens. I liked that movie. Every time I watch it, I get a different interpretation of what it means. A lot of people like to say that it's based on what happened to Eilean Mòr, but I heavily disagree. It's more like the murders at the Smalls Lighthouse in 1801. Maybe that's a story for another day. But anyways, the Fresnel lens, it's not going to rotate on its own, at least not in 1899. So it had what's known as a weight-driven clockwork mechanism, and someone would need to wind it up periodically. I've read anywhere from every 30 minutes to every 2 hours or so, and that is where the lighthouse keepers come in. Now, in addition to keeping the mechanism wound so the lens would rotate, a lighthouse keeper would be responsible for replenishing the kerosene fuel, trimming the wick used in the lamp, cleaning both the lamp and the lens, as well as any other glass the light passes through, performing repairs to the light mechanism or the lighthouse structure, and of course making sure the light rotated at the correct speed. And since these earlier models of lighthouses needed tending so frequently, lighthouse keepers worked in pairs or triples to make sure everything was monitored properly. There would be the principal lightkeeper, one or two assistant lightkeepers under him, and some stations also had what's known as an occasional lightkeeper, normally a local, trained to assist when needed, like in cases of emergency or if one of the keepers got sick or holidays, stuff like that. But lighthouses, by their very nature, are sometimes in very hard-to-reach places. The lighthouse at Eilean Mòr, for example, was in a pretty remote place, and the Flannan Isles were not heavily populated. There's virtually nobody there. So as a backup, the NLB would sometimes pay non-keepers to observe the light. And if for whatever reason the light wasn't on, or if the keepers put out any emergency signals, that person, that observer, would send a telegram to the NLB so they could come and help. I mean, it makes sense. It's a backup system in case something goes wrong with the lighthouse and the keepers can't send for help themselves. Now, with all of these precautions, it's clear that the NLB took their lighthouses seriously. To let the light go out without reason was to fail at your job, which would also mean your dismissal. And the lighthouse was more than just a job. It was also their home. Remember that keepers and their families would live at the nearby shore station. So when the light went out on December 7th, 1900, a year after it was first put on, and it didn't come back, it was clear that there was something seriously wrong at the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse. At the time of the incident, there were 4 men hired to keep the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse. James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the assistant keeper, Donald McArthur, an occasional lightkeeper who was substituting for another guy on sick leave, and Joseph Moore, who was another assistant keeper who was on shore leave at the time. This was normal. 3 men would keep the lighthouse, and the 4th would remain at the shore station, and then they would rotate out. James Ducat became a lighthouse keeper when he was 22, first serving as an assistant in various lighthouses. He was promoted to principal keeper after about 18 years, just to give you an idea of how long these guys trained and how well they knew their job. And by the time he arrived at Eilean Mòr, he had worked as a keeper for 22 years, so he was very experienced. Thomas Marshall had nearly 5 years of experience, and the occasional keeper, Donald McArthur, had only just joined the NLB that year and only had about 26 nights training. So, essentially, he was a complete newbie. The 3 would have been working together to manage the lighthouse, each pulling 4-hour shifts after dark, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and then 2 a.m. to 6. The light would be turned off at sunrise, and the group would eat and do their maintenance work. But in December, something went horribly wrong at the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse, and the men disappeared. So let's start with what we know before we speculate on what might have happened. The NLB paid a man named Roderick Mackenzie to be an observer, the person who kept an eye out for any troubles, but he wasn't a keeper. He had last seen the light on December 7th, 1900, and according to a report filed by Robert Muirhead, a superintendent with the NLB who investigated what happened, quote, "The commissioners appointed Roderick Mackenzie to look out daily for signals that might be shown from the rock, and to note each night whether the light was seen or not seen. The tower itself was not seen, even with the assistance of a powerful telescope, between the 7th and the 29th December. The light was, however, seen on the 7th, but was not seen on the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. It was seen on the 12th, but not again until the 26th, when Joseph Moore arrived." End quote. And by the way, you can find all of these sources through the Northern Lighthouse Board website, which is pretty cool, and I've linked it in the episode's description. On December 15th, 1900, Captain Francis Holman, on board the SS Arctur, passed by the Flannan Isles en route from Philadelphia to Leith, a port that served Edinburgh. He had made this trip many times, it was a regular run for his cargo ship, but he knew something was wrong this time. Based on his calculations and position, he knew that he was near the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse. It was a clear night, but there was no light. And when he arrived in Leith, Captain Holman reported it to his company, the ones who owned his ship, but in the 2 days between noticing the absence of light and arriving in Leith, the Arctur had struck a rock, sustained damage, and was taking on water. So, of course, there were other more important things to deal with when he got to port. And despite the fact that Captain Holman did tell his superiors, they didn't pass on the information to the NLB until December 28th. But by that point, the NLB had found out on their own that something was amiss. Periodically, a ship named the Hesperus would bring new supplies to various lighthouses in the area, and in addition to supplies, on this trip, it was also bringing back Joseph Mòr, the fourth keeper who was on shore leave. He was going to come and relieve one of the other men. Now, it was meant to arrive on the 20th of December, but because of bad weather and storms, it didn't actually arrive until the 26th. So if we take a look at that chronology, it had been about 2 weeks since anyone saw a light. Roderick Mackenzie claims to have seen the light on the 12th, but that was the last time. So let's follow Joseph Mòr along as he arrives back to the lighthouse on the 26th. I'm going to read from the letter he wrote on the 28th, because in this case, I think it's best to hear from the man who was actually there. I made a few adjustments for readability, but I left most of it as it is. So, quote, "It was with deep regret I wish you to learn the very sad affair that has taken place here during the past fortnight, namely the disappearance of my 2 fellow lightkeepers, Mr. Ducat and Mr. Marshall, together with the occasional keeper Donald McArthur from off this island. As you are aware, the relief was made on the 26th. That day, as on other relief days, we arrived at the Flannan Isles, and not seeing the lighthouse flag flying, we thought that they did not perceive us coming. The steamer's horn was sounded several times, still no reply. At last, the captain deemed it prudent to lower a boat and land a man if it was possible. I was the first to land, leaving the rest in the boat till I should return from the lighthouse. I went up, and on coming to the entrance gate, I found it closed. I made for the kitchen and storeroom. On entering the kitchen, I looked at the fireplace and saw that the fire was not lighted for some days. I then entered the rooms in succession, found the beds empty, just as they left them in the early morning. I did not take time to search further, for I only too well knew something serious had occurred. I darted out and made for the landing. When I reached there, I informed the others that the place was deserted. They came up with me the second time, so as to make sure, but unfortunately the first impression was only too true. We proceeded to the light room, where everything was in proper order. The lamp was cleaned, the fountain full, blinds on the windows, etc. We left and proceeded on board the steamer. The captain ordered me back again to the island, accompanied by some other men who were to do duty with me till timely aid should arrive. We went ashore and proceeded up to the light room and lighted the light in the proper time that night and every night since. The following day we traversed the island from end to end, but still nothing to be seen to convince us how it happened. Nothing appears touched at East Landing to show that they were taken from there. Ropes are all in their respective places in the shelter, just as they were left after the last relief on the 7th. On the west side, it is somewhat different. We had an old box halfway up the railway for holding West Landing mooring ropes and tackle, and it has gone. Some of the ropes, it appears, got washed out of it. They lay strewn on the rocks near the crane. The crane itself is safe. The iron railings along the passage connecting the railway with the footpath to the landing were broken in several places. Also, the railing around the crane and the handrail for making mooring rope fast for the boat is entirely carried away. Now, there is nothing to give us an indication that it was there the poor men lost their lives, only that Mr. Marshall had his sea boots on and oilskins. Also, Mr. Ducat had his sea boots on. He had no oilskin, only an old waterproof coat, and that is gone. Donald McArthur left his coat behind, which shows, as far as I know, that he went out in shirt sleeves. He never used any other coat on previous occasions, only the one I am referring to. Mr. J. Mòr, Assistant Lightkeeper, Flannan Isles Lighthouse, 28th December, 1900. End quote. So, if we simplify this letter, we know that Joseph Mòr arrived and found nothing obviously wrong with the inside of the lighthouse, but noted that the west side suffered some kind of damage. The box that held the mooring ropes and the tackle was gone, some of the railings were damaged, and there was debris on the rocks below. Now, according to the book Rock Lighthouses of Britain by Christopher Nicholson, there was an uneaten meal of cold meat, pickles, and boiled potatoes still on the table, and one of the chairs was apparently upturned. However, the two primary sources from the men who actually explored the scene, Joseph Moore and the superintendent, Robert Muirhead, don't mention food on the table, so this was added after the fact, likely to make the story even juicier. Now, Moore did note that there had not been a fire in a while, and though the light obviously wasn't operating, the machinery itself was fine. And other than the damage to the west side of the island, nothing. The captain of the Hesperus sent a telegram to the NLB immediately, explaining how they saw no signs of life. And he noted in that telegram that, quote, "The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that." End quote. Very curious. Well, we know that the lighthouse keepers kept logs, so was there anything in the logs that might shed some light on what happened? Pun absolutely intended, by the way. Well, when the superintendent of the NLB, Robert Muirhead, arrived to investigate what happened, he did a very thorough search, including through those logbooks, and here's what he found. On December 7th, the assistant keeper, Thomas Marshall, wrote that the winds were the worst he has seen in 20 years. And he also wrote that the principal keeper, Ducat, had been very quiet. An occasional keeper, McArthur, had been crying, which was strange. 20 miles over in Lewis, the men reported that there wasn't any bad weather. But as anyone who's spent any time in Britain will tell you, it can rain in one town and be perfectly sunny in the next one over. So if there was bad weather, winds, and waves affecting the Flannan Isles, it's very possible that the Isle of Lewis, 20 miles away, didn't see the same thing. I would trust the logbooks in this case, there's no reason to lie. Now, logs from the 13th state that that storm had gotten worse, and all three of them were praying for their safety. And in the final log entry, dated December 15th, Principal Keeper Ducat noted that they had set up for nighttime duty. They filled the lamp, trimmed the wick, cleaned the lens and machinery, and were ready to go. And curiously, this is the same day that the SS Arctur passed by, later that night, and noted that the light was out. Now, some also claim that there was an entry that said, quote, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." But according to Lucy Davidson over at History Hit, a later investigation proved this was falsified, just an attempt to sensationalize the story. Muirhead never mentioned anything like that, and if we can't find it in a primary source, if we don't have concrete evidence that that line exists in the logbook, then we have to assume it's fictionalized, or at the very least exaggerated. Now, like Moore, Muirhead also noticed that one of their coats was left hung up, so only two of them were dressed properly for the rough, cold December weather. It was also against regulation for the lighthouse to be unattended at any time, so Muirhead was struck by that too. What must have happened for all three men to leave the lighthouse, one of them not even dressed properly? And their bodies were never recovered. Based on the clues left behind, both Moore and Muirhead came to one solid conclusion, which I agree with. Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is usually the best one. But just for fun, before we reveal the likely story, let's go over some of the more outlandish explanations that have cropped up over the years. So in researching for this episode, I came across all kinds of fun theories about what might have happened to the lighthouse keepers. One suggested that a sea monster got them. Now, Scottish folklore is no stranger to sea creatures. For example, the Kelpie, a Scottish water spirit that often takes the form of a horse. Kelpies live in lakes and rivers, and humans are drawn to them like a siren, and after they hop on the horse in an attempt to claim it, the Kelpie goes back to the watery depths and drowns its victims. And then there's the blue men of the Minch, also known as the storm Kelpies. Like my husband told us earlier, the Minch is a strait in a channel that separates the Outer Hebrides from the Scottish mainland, and unlike traditional Kelpies, the blue men appear to look, well, like blue men. They can create storms and sink ships. And sure, the Flannan Isles are on the other side of the Outer Hebrides, but you never know. And there are also stories of mermaids and mermen and water monsters and fairies and all the lovely creatures of Celtic folklore. In 1882, a German ship near Lewis even reported seeing a sea serpent. And while it would certainly be cool to have an eldritch horror rising from the deep, tentacles poised to attack these unsuspecting men and drag them down, we know that these men weren't gobbled up by a sea creature. It doesn't fit the facts. Now, I've even read theories that a giant seabird came and scooped them up as well, but that's also highly unlikely. They'd have to be like the great eagles of Middle-earth to be able to pull that off. And outside of the supernatural explanations, there are some more realistic ones as well that don't really fit the bill. One prevailing theory is that the occasional keeper, Donald McArthur, might have gotten into a fight with Ducat and Marshall, and the three fell over the cliff's edge. Nicholson's book on lighthouses notes that, quote, among the more colorful of the rumors was that one of the keepers killed his two companions and disposed of their bodies. He was then overcome with remorse and took his own life in a similar fashion, end quote. But there's no real proof to support this claim. Author Keith McCloskey, in his book, The Lighthouse, The Mystery of the Eilean Mòr Lighthouse Keepers, writes that, quote, while this is certainly a possibility, as there is nothing to contradict the theory, none of the circumstances seem to support such a theory. There was nothing in the local press reports or local rumor saying that either of the men were in any way unpleasant characters. However, it is certain that if there was anything untoward, it would have surfaced after the tragedy. End quote. So, there you go. It's not likely we have a Willem Dafoe, Robert Pattinson lighthouse situation where tensions boiled over and the men became violent. So then what really happened to the lighthouse keepers at Eilean Mòr? If we apply Occam's razor here, we get a pretty simple explanation of what happened. The men disappeared on the afternoon of the 15th. James Ducat filled out the logs around 9 a.m. that morning, but the Arctur didn't see the light that night, so sometime during that day, the three men disappeared. Now, since the machinery inside the lighthouse was still intact, there wasn't anything like a leak or an explosion or anything like that. The only real thing out of place was the west side of the island, where the iron railings and ropes and other infrastructure had been washed away. Some were just gone, but others were visible on the rocks below, which means that some combination of wind and water hit the west side of the island, the side facing the might of the Atlantic Ocean, breaking the railings. The men, probably the two dressed for the weather, Ducat and Marshall, went out to deal with the damage. Perhaps something happened to one of them, and the occasional keeper, Donald McArthur, was called over in a rush, and sensing the urgency, he ran out of the lighthouse without the proper clothing on. And perhaps, in their attempts at rescuing their fallen companion, the three of them were swept off the cliff's edge by waves or strong winds, and considering that there was nothing left behind, no blood, no drag marks, no weapons, nothing to indicate foul play, the most likely explanation is that wild weather took them. And it's supported by what was written in the logbooks about horrifying weather, right? The worst in 20 years if we take what Marshall said at face value. So perhaps it's not the most fantastical answer to the mystery, but it's likely the correct one. Over the years, the story of the lighthouse keepers of Eilean Mòr have gone far beyond local legend and folklore. In 1912, Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a poem titled Flannan Isles, and of course it's all about the lighthouse mystery. And here are some stanzas from that poem. Quote, though three men dwell on Flannan Isles to keep the lamp alight, as we steered under the lee we caught no glimmer through the night. A passing ship at dawn had brought the news, and quickly we set sail to find out what strange thing might ail the keepers of the deep sea light. Yet as we crowded through the door, we only saw a table, spread for dinner, meat and cheese and bread, but all untouched and no one there, as though, when they sat down to eat, ere they could even taste, alarm had come, and they in haste had risen and left the bread and meat, for at the table head a chair lay tumbled on the floor. End quote. There's a lot more to that poem, but I wanted to stop there because that's probably where the rumor about the food on the table and a toppled over chair came from. It was just added to make the mystery more appealing for his poem, but over time, it's been assumed as fact instead of just fiction. In the end, this story, though technically unsolved, is a testament to the dangers of working in some of the world's most remote locations. Though there are still some that tend to the lighthouses, for the most part they've become modernized and automated. The era of 2 to 3 men, or sometimes women, keeping the lighthouse, living together, and battling the elements has ended. And though we don't 100% know what happened to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Douglas MacArthur, their names have lived on, and their story is still told to this day. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and check out some of my other ones if you want more. If you want to support the show, I've got a link in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. a site for fans to fund the creative works of small creators like me, but without having to open up an account and do all that extra stuff. Be sure to like and follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.